Fate has been an insanely popular series for decades now, originating as a visual novel written and published by Type Moon in the way long ago 2004, titled Fate Stay Night. Upon release, it quickly became a hit, helping turn Type Moon into a household name among visual novel fans. Since then, the series has branched out into a number of very popular anime, manga, and game releases, including the mobile app Fate Grand Order. It has become such a phenomenon that even if you're not a fan, you've almost definitely seen some of the characters in other media circles, whether it be memes or the fact that a specific character has become something of a mascot for a particular group of people. The plot format differs from release to release, however the main focus lies on mages summoning servants to aid them in a major conflict, whether it be a battle for the Holy Grail or some extinction cataclysm or whatever Fate Go is about. Whatever the case, the servants that are summoned are people of great renown in some capacity, whether they are great warriors or leaders from history, characters of legend, or frickin' Da Vinci, who is a woman now because reasons.
Boobies.
But despite the popularity of the Fate series, I'm not aware of anyone who has made a video diving into the real-world history behind the servants summoned, which is a real shame because some of these guys are way cooler than Fate depicts them. So I decided my 5 subscriber ass will be the one to take the leap and see if the people think that this video is as cool of an idea as I think it is. Now I can't cover the whole series in this one video, so I'm gonna zero in on just one part, where it all began, Fate Stay Night. The plot of Stay Night revolves around a cast of 7 mages that are selected to compete in a battle royale for the Holy Grail, with the promise that the Holy Grail can grant any wish the winner asks for. Each mage, or master, summons a servant to fight alongside them. Each servant belongs to one of 7 classes: Archer, Saber, Caster, Berserker, Lancer, Assassin, and Rider. One servant of each class is selected and their abilities correlate with the class they belong to. For example, Sabers fight with swords and Archers use bows, generally. Literally all this guy fucking does is fling random bullshit out of portals. How the hell is he an archer? Now before we begin, I should probably issue a spoiler warning. In the Fate series, the identities of the servants themselves tend to be a bit of a spoiler, so if you care about that sort of thing, maybe go watch the series and then come back to this video. But boom, there are 3 different Fate Stay Night animes. Which one should I watch? The original Stay Night anime that came out in 2006 is a pretty safe starting point. With the later remakes, certain characters don't get a whole lot of screen time depending on which one you watch, but with the original you at least get a decent view of all the masters and servants involved. But if the original Stay Night feels a little too retro for you youngsters, you could go for the 2015 Unlimited Blade Works. You'll be missing a little bit of context if you don't first watch Fate Zero, but it's not as bad as some people might have you think. You should be able to watch the whole thing and be able to understand all the main plot points just fine. But whatever you do not start with Heaven's Feel. Those movies are written and directed under the assumption that the viewer has already watched both Fate Zero and one of the other Stay Nights. It leaves out and even skims through a lot of context and you'll just be lost. Now if you want to be a real go-getter, you can just read the visual novel. You can find the remastered version on marketplaces like Steam. And now with the stage set, let's get into today's history lesson, shall we? Now to punch those who did not heed my spoiler warning, we are going to be starting with probably the biggest spoiler in this whole video, with the identity of Stay Night's Archer class servant. The identity of Archer is Shiro Emiya, the main character of Fate Stay Night. You know, when I said the servants summoned were historical figures, that was a bit of a fib. Through some loopholes, it is actually possible to summon servants from the future or even the present to fight alongside the masters. And in this case, the servant summoned is a future version of the main character himself. Crazy, yeah. Now, I'm a pretty big fan of what this guy is and what he stands for in the Fate Stay Night series, but explaining Fate lore isn't really the purpose of this video, so I'm just gonna move on to the next one because historically, there's nothing to talk about here. Now onward to our real history lesson. The most iconic servant in Fate Stay Night, Saber. Now you all likely know who this is. The identity of Saber is none other than Arthur Pendragon, a British legend. Or in this case, Artoria Pendragon, because here in the Fate universe we love our gender swaps. But in real-world history, Arthur Pendragon is a king of Britain who wields the holy sword Excalibur and the leader of the Knights of the Round Table. It is believed that his legend originated either in Wales or in northern Britain, and though it is widely thought that he is purely just a fictional character, some speculate that he is based on a real warrior who led the British against Saxon invaders in the 6th century. Arthurian legend developed in Europe between 1136 and 1485, and was revived in the 19th century and is still extremely popular to this very day. The more mythical elements of his story was brought on by Geoffrey of Monmouth, and was expanded upon by other writers who was inspired by the more fantastical qualities of the story. One writer in particular being Sir Thomas Malory, who wrote Le Morte d'Arthur, translated as Death of Arthur, and was published in 1485. But as for the story itself, it goes a little something like this. A wizard named Merlin spoke to a mighty king named Uther Pendragon and convinced him to sleep with a queen named Igraine, who happened to be the wife of another king. Very naughty. Though Merlin had but one condition, that when the child of their union was born, it would be given to him. And all that happened as planned. They got together, they did their thing, they had a child, and they just gave it to Merlin, no questions asked. And when it came time to name the kid, Merlin said, "Wow, that king was a really nice fella. I really want to name his son after him." What was his name again? Arthur, that's the one. I'll name him that. Alright, I made that last part up. But Merlin would give him to a guy named Sir Hector to raise alongside his own son, Kay, later known as Sir Kay. Many years pass and Arthur is now a grown man. He accompanies his brother Kay and his father Hector to a tournament where Kay is supposed to compete, and he effectively acts as his brother's caddy carrying his sword. Upon arriving at the tournament, he realized that he had forgotten his brother's sword back at home, and then dashes off to try to retrieve it. But on his way, he finds a sword in this forest stuck in stone, and decides that it would be faster just to take that one instead. And that's the point where Merlin arrives to explain to Arthur that the person who draws the sword from the stone is destined to be the true King of Britain. Now, something I didn't know till I did the research for this video is that the sword from the stone that Arthur drew wasn't actually Excalibur. The sword that Arthur drew from the stone is actually broken in a battle against Sir Pellinore. Merlin then leads him to a mystical body of water where Arthur throws the sword in. Moments later, the Lady of the Lake emerges and hands him the new sword, and this sword is the Holy Sword of Excalibur. With the help of this new sword, he forces the other lords to recognize his legitimacy to the throne. He then marries the beautiful Queen Guinevere and sets up his court in the city of Camelot. After being recognized as the king, he invites all the mightiest knights of the realm to dine with him in his banquet hall. But conflict would arise as all the knights began fighting over the best seats next to their new king. Avoiding future conflict, it would be Arthur's father-in-law who designed the iconic round table, giving each knight equal seating in front of King Arthur. Now, in Arthurian legend, King Arthur and his Knights of the Round Tables go on many adventures, but it would be their quest for the Holy Grail that would be the most iconic. Unlike the Fate series, where the Holy Grail is said to have the ability to grant wishes, in Arthurian legend, the Holy Grail has healing powers and the ability to grant eternal life. Now, over the years, the Grail took many forms. In the French version of the story, it was a platter. In the Welsh version, it was a cauldron. It was when Sir Malory revised the story that it became the cup that Jesus Christ used during the Last Supper, and thus called the Holy Grail. It was said that the Grail's quest could only be completed by a knight pure of heart. This wasn't actually completed by King Arthur himself. This was actually completed by Sir Galahad, the son of King Arthur's right-hand man, Sir Lancelot. Speaking of Lancelot, we're actually going to backtrack a little bit. Lancelot actually had an affair with King Arthur's wife, Queen Guinevere. The betrayal of King Arthur's best friend is revealed to him by his illegitimate son, Mordred, who then challenges Arthur's right to the throne. The fall of Arthur is brought on by the final battle against his own son, where Mordred is eventually killed and Arthur is fatally wounded. Knowing that the end is nigh, Sir Bedivere helps Arthur from the field, and together they return Excalibur to the Lady of the Lake. After which King Arthur dies and is carried away on a ship to the Isle of Avalon, which is where the legend of King Arthur meets its end. And next we're talking about the Lancer class servant. Lancer is the Irish demigod hero, Cú Chulainn. Now I want to do a little disclaimer about the name pronunciation in this section, because I've got some conflicting reports with the correct pronunciation with some of the names I'm going to be mentioning here. For example, Cú Chulainn seems to be the most popular way to pronounce his name, so that's the one I'm going to be going with. But other pronunciations like Cú Chulainn with more of an H sound I also ran into. And obviously I'm not from that part of the world, so I don't really know how to tell which one's right and which one's wrong. So if I say a different pronunciation than what you're used to, just bear with me, I promise I tried to get this right. But with that out of the way, I gotta say, this guy is way cooler than fate depicts him. I knew nothing about Cú Chulainn going into this, and he was easily the highlight of the research portion of this video. It was so much fun. There's so much here that just borders on like cartoonish. There's so much I just can't include for the sake of time, but it's still very fun. So anyway, let's get into it. As stated before, Cú Chulainn is a demigod. He was born from the human woman Diechtine, and his father was Lugh, the Celtic god of the sun and light. Cú Chulainn's conception differs a bit from version to version of the story. Some versions have Diechtine swallowing a miniaturized version of Lugh who is hiding in a cup of her water, and other versions has her just simply dreaming of him. Both are kinda unorthodox ways of conceiving a baby, but you know, can't argue with results. Now in artwork, Cú Chulainn's appearance seems pretty normal, but the way he's described in legend is anything but. He has multicolored hair that is brown at the base, blood red in the middle, and golden yellow at the tips. Each of his cheeks have 4 dimples which are also multicolored, being blue, red, yellow, and green. He also has 7 toes on each foot, 7 fingers in each hand, and 7 pupils in each of his eyes. But despite looking like a human experiment gone horribly wrong, apparently the ladies found him irresistibly attractive. Cú Chulainn is also known for going into rages, where his body would transform into something that of a monster. In these rages, it is said that blood would spill down from the crown of his head, fires would spark from the end of each hair, a bright light would shine from his forehead, and he would close one eye till it was no wider than the eye of a needle, and the other eye would bulge out of his head. His mouth would open extremely wide, all the way out to his ears, bearing rows of sharp teeth. And Cú Chulainn wasn't actually his name. His birth name was Setanta. Cú Chulainn is actually a title he would come to be known by. But to get there we have to go back, when his legend first started, when Setanta was just 7 years old. As you would expect from a demigod, Setanta was extremely gifted and athletic, and fiercely competitive. One day the young Setanta would hear a man speaking of a prophecy, that if a warrior took up arms on a certain day, he would be the greatest warrior of his age. Wanting that title for himself, Setanta would in fact go out on that very day, and prove his strength by going into his first rage. Yeah, imagine that, a 7-year-old turning into a Hulk. But there's a bit of a problem. Setanta didn't hear the second half of that prophecy. Whoever took up arms would be known as the greatest warrior of his age, but also die young. But that's something for future Setanta to worry about. Present Setanta's gonna be a hero. But that takes us to his second amazing act and how he actually earned the name Cú Chulainn. See, Setanta wanted to attend a banquet held by Chulainn, who is a great blacksmith in Irish mythology, but he shown up late and was confronted by Chulainn's guard dog. And for context, it said that this dog is such a beast that it had to be held on 3 leashes, held by 9 stout warriors. Despite still only being 7 years old, Setanta would kill the dog, and upon finding out, Chulainn was not pleased. But it would all turn out alright, as Setanta would agree to replace Chulainn's guard dog. But until he was able to find a proper replacement, he himself would act as Chulainn's guard. And his time in this position is what got him the nickname Cú Chulainn, which translates to Hound of Chulainn. And as Cú Chulainn matured, he began training as a warrior, and his competitive attitude translated into picking fights with his peers. And an interesting little fun fact is that Cuchulainn didn't have any facial hair, which is important because at the time, facial hair in Ireland was considered as a mark of masculinity, so a lot of people just refused to fight him because they saw him as still a boy. So, to get around that, Cuchulainn would actually wear a fake beard to goat people into fighting him. That is hilarious to me. But Cuchulainn would meet an Irish princess named Emer and fall in love. In order to impress her father and allow him to marry her, he would travel to Scotland to train with the famed female warrior Skaha. Under Skaha, Cuchulainn would train with a number of weapons, but most importantly, this is when he would obtain the famous spear that would become synonymous with his legacy, Gaebolga. A spear is said to be able to travel at lightning speeds and inflict an additional 30 wounds with just a single strike. And during his stay in Scotland, he would confront Skaha's sister and rival, Aoife. And then, being the playboy that he is, upon defeating her in battle, he would begin having relations with Aoife. This affair would lead to Aoife becoming pregnant with a son that she would name Connla. Now this would end in tragedy as Connla would eventually travel to Ireland to challenge his father. But Connla refused to state who he was, and it wasn't until Cuchulainn had dealt the final blow to him that he had realized who he had just killed, making Cuchulainn the second hero that we talk about today who killed their own child. That's not going to become a trend, right? But returning to the timeline, Cuchulainn, after completing his training with Skaha, goes back to Ireland. But Emer's father is still not impressed and refused to let him marry her. Cuchulainn, being the level-headed guy that he is, he kills a bunch of his men, steals a bunch of his stuff, and kidnaps Emer, and is able to successfully marry her. Now, the marriage would have some rocky patches as Cuchulainn would cheat on her. A lot. One particular instance, when he cheated on her with a fairy named Fond, would be so bad that they both had to drink a druid's potion so that they would forget about the whole thing. But other than all that, Cuchulainn would do exactly what he set out to do, be the greatest warrior of his age. He'd be known as a great leader, and ride into battle on the back of a chariot driven by Leg, the king of charioteers. The chariot being pulled by horses Lyth Macha and Dub Sangland. During his time, Cuchulainn did a lot of things, fought in a lot of battles, made some friends, and of course, some enemies. One of which being Medb, the Queen of Connacht, who would trick Cuchulainn's best friend and foster brother, Ferdiad, into turning against him. The two would fight continuously for 3 whole days before Cuchulainn was able to strike the final blow, later writing a poem to lament his now fallen brother. Another one of Cuchulainn's enemies is Lugaid mac Conroy. Lugaid was a legendary warrior in his own right, and hated Cuchulainn because he killed his father and had an affair with his mother. Wow. Xbox lobbies be damned, he actually did it. But Lugaid and the Queen of Connacht would conspire to bring down Cuchulainn once and for all. Despite seemingly being an unstoppable force, Cuchulainn was bound by 2 geas, or magical taboos, that if broken would lead to his downfall. These geas being that he cannot eat the meat of a dog, and he can't refuse food offered to him by a woman. This was taken advantage of, as Cuchulainn was put in a situation where a woman had offered him dog meat, meaning he had to break one of his geas. Lugaid mac Conroy would use this opportunity to launch his attack. It was a long battle, and Cuchulainn would tie himself to a stone with his own intros in an attempt to keep himself standing, in order to continue fighting against the enemy forces. However, he would eventually die with his sword raised to the heavens, but even still, no one dared to approach his body. Not until a crow that was said to be Morgan, the Irish god of war, death, and fate, landed on his shoulder, confirming that Cuchulainn was now dead. And now we go to servant number 4, Berserker. This towering hulk that looks like it could rival Cuchulainn's rage state is Greek mythology's most popular character, Hercules. Being the product of an affair between the Greek god Zeus and a mortal woman, Hercules is the second example of a demigod we're talking about in this video. And the second point of proof that across all time periods, European gods really had a thing for human women, despite, dare I say, all the fine goddesses that would be available. Funny how that works. And speaking of fine goddesses, Zeus was married to Hera, the goddess of women, marriage, and family. Upon learning about Zeus's infidelity, Hera was none too pleased, and decided she wanted to make Hercules' life a living hell as revenge for her husband's deeds. Shortly after Hercules was born, his mother would be fearful of Hera's revenge and decided to take him to Athena, the protector of heroes and the Greek god of wisdom and war. Now Athena would end up taking Hercules directly to Hera, but without telling Hera who he was. Recognizing him as just some orphan, Hera would take pity and decide to nurse the child, her divine milk being the source of the supernatural powers that Hercules becomes known for. After the nursing, Athena would take him back and return him to his parents, to be raised alongside his half-brother Iphicles. When Hercules and his brother was just 8 months old, Hera would send 2 giant snakes to their chamber to kill them. However, due to now having superpowers due to feeding from Hera, even at a young age, Hercules was easily able to strangle the 2 snakes. Hercules would grow into maturity, and due to his demigod powers would become a person of renown amongst his community. And alongside Hermes, the god of trade and the messenger of the gods, Hercules was appointed the patron and protector of Gymnasia, a large building used for athletic activities as well as learning. Along with his regular duties, he would be known for demonstrating feats of strength as well as playing with and entertaining the children there. Eventually, Hercules would marry the king of Creon's daughter, Megaria, or just Meg if you're like me and grew up watching the Disney movie. And for a while they're pretty happy and begin raising up some children of their own. But paradise would come crashing down as Hera would return, still seeking revenge on Hercules. She would afflict him with a fit of madness, and in his rage Hercules would murder his own children. Oh no, this is gonna be a trend, isn't it? After Hercules' madness had been cured with some herbs, he understandably felt a great deal of shame, and not knowing what to do, he ran to the Oracle of Delphi for help. But unfortunately for Hercules, Hera was already influencing the Oracle, and Hercules was directed to serve King Eurystheus for 10 years, being forced to perform any task Eurystheus asked of him as punishment for killing his own children. For context, Hercules and Eurystheus was rivals. In fact, the only reason Eurystheus was king was because Hera accelerated his development so that the throne would fall to him instead of Hercules. But it would be during this time that Hercules would complete the most famous part of his legend, his 12 labors, and upon completion he would be absolved of his sins and granted immortality. Now I'm not going to get into every labor for the sake of time, but they are all extremely difficult tasks that only a person of great exception could complete. But some examples were killing the 9-headed Hydra, wrangling Cerberus and returning him to the underworld, and cleaning a stable in a single day. No, you don't understand, the stable's like really big, man. You have to be a hero to clean it in a single day. But Hercules would serve his time and find his atonement, and upon release be looking to start again. He would fall in love with another princess named Iole, and her father promised that anyone who was able to beat his son in an archery contest could have her hand in marriage. Not wanting to pass up on this opportunity, Hercules would enter and win the contest. However, the king, being a sore loser, would go back on his word. Hercules would abduct Iole, killing the king and his sons in the process, with the exception of Iphitus, who had betrayed his father and helped Hercules in this effort. Hercules and Iphitus would become great friends afterwards. However, a little ways down the line, Hera would strike again, afflicting Hercules with another fit of madness where he would grab Iphitus and throw him over a city wall where he would fall to his death. This time his atonement would be to serve Queen Umphalme for 3 years, where she would force him to wear women's clothes and perform what was traditionally thought of as women's tasks. Though apparently he didn't think this was all that bad, because upon being freed he would marry her, and though this isn't confirmed, allegedly they had a son together. But we're gonna fast forward to when Hercules is now married to a different woman named Deianira. Hercules' end is brought on when Deianira is tricked by one of his rivals, where she is given a shirt for Hercules to wear, unknowing that this shirt had been dipped in venom. Though his status as a demigod was enough to stop the poison from killing him instantly, he would slowly and painfully lose strength. He would climb Mount Etna where he would build his funeral pyre, laying down using his own club as a pillow. After passing, Zeus would envelop him in a cloud and take him up to the stars where he would rest amongst the constellations. Moving on to the 5th servant, and up to this point everyone we've talked about has been legendary heroes and the main characters of their own tales, and this one's a bit of an exception to that. Fate Stay Night's rider is the serpent woman, Medusa, the most feared of the Gorgons. But depending on which version of the tale you hear, she may not have always been a horrible monster. In some Greek myths, she was originally a beautiful woman that many men lusted over. One man she caught the attention of was the god of the sea, Poseidon. though that attention would not go to a good place. Poseidon would corner her inside of Athena's temple and force himself on her. And even though she didn't have any consent in the matter, when Athena heard that she had played a part in desecrating her temple, she was very unhappy. Infuriated, Athena put a terrible curse on her that turns her into the monster that we all know her as now. Her hair would turn to snakes, and it said that she was so grotesque that just one look at her would turn the viewer to stone. Now shunned from society, Medusa would live out her days in a remote lair, until one day she would be tracked down by one of Zeus's sons, Perseus. Perseus would slay Medusa by beheading her, however she still remained relevant to Greek myths even after her death. Her severed head was still able to turn viewers to stone, and Perseus would use it during his travels, until eventually it was given to Athena, where she would infuse it into her armor. It is also said that as Perseus traveled home, he would cross through the plains of Libya, and as he did, droplets of blood would fall down from Medusa's head, turning into venomous snakes, fueling another myth as to why Libya has so many snakes. But after Athena had used Medusa's head to adorn her breastplate and shield, she had kept a couple vials of her blood. It being said that one vial is a deadly poison, while the other one can cure any disease. Athena also kept a piece of Medusa's hair, that she would later give to Hercules. This piece of hair being said to have the power to inflict terror on anyone who viewed it, even by accident. But that's the story of Medusa. Nice, short and sweet. But next is Assassin, who like Medusa is typically thought of as a side character in a more iconic legend. But even still, he maintains a fair bit of popularity and influence in his culture of origin. But Assassin is known as the Japanese swordsman Sasaki Kojiro. Kojiro was born in 1575 during the Sengoku period of Japan, which was a pretty trialist time for old Nihon, marked with a lot of social upheaval and military conflict. But though it is unknown exactly where he was born, it's believed Kojiro hails from the Ichizen province, which is in the modern-day Fukui prefecture. Taking up interest in swordsmanship from a young age, Kojiro would study under the master Toda Seigen, who is a renowned swordsman in his own right. Though some debate that it wasn't Seigen who mentored him, but instead Kanamaki Jisai, who was one of Seigen's students. But we're going to continue on under the assumption that it was Seigen who taught him, since that is the more accepted theory. But either way, Kojiro became very well versed in the art of swordsmanship, despite adopting a different style from his master. See, Seigen was a master of the kodachi, or a short katana, while Kojiro used a nodachi, long katana, about 20 centimeters longer than the traditional katana. As Kojiro's abilities improved, he eventually was able to defeat Seigen's younger brother in a duel, and with his growing reputation, he earned a pretty cool nickname, Demon of the Western Providence. And upon establishing himself, he would end up opening up his own school of swordsmanship. He called it Gonryu, or Large Rock Style, and he'd of course be known for the very technique that would become synonymous with his legend, the Tsubame Geishi, or the Turning Swallow Cut. As the namesake would suggest, it was inspired by the quick movements of a swallow in flight, which is fitting because Kojiro himself was known to be incredibly fast. Unfortunately, the subtleties on how the technique was actually performed have been lost to time. However, it's said to involve a quick upward slash followed by a swift downward cut, designed to strike an opponent who attempts to dodge the initial attack. But as Kojiro's popularity would increase, so would the target on his back. See, the swordsmanship culture in Japan at the time was ferociously competitive, with a lot of warriors traveling around issuing challenges to see who's the best. And Kojiro was no different, often traveling around and competing in duels. Some of the victories that brought Kojiro the majority of his fame were against master swordsmen Ito Itosai and Tsukahara Bokuden, as well as a fun little story where he once brought down 3 men armed with just an iron fan. But all of this would pale in comparison with his duel with one of Japan's most recognizable figures, Miyamoto Musashi, cementing both of their places in history as he would be the last duel either man ever competed in. By 1612, the year that this duel would take place, both Kojiro and Musashi was widely regarded as the 2 greatest warriors in all of Japan, and of course opened up the door for their inevitable face-off that would take place on April 13th. Kojiro and Musashi agreed to meet on a small island that was then called Funajima. At the time, this was considered a remote place, which is why Musashi wanted to convince Kojiro to meet him there, as Musashi was afraid that Kojiro's disciples would kill him if he were to win. Thus, an isolated location was best if he wanted to get Kojiro by himself. Kojiro would make it to the island at the designated meeting time, but Musashi did not, and it's believed that he did this to break Kojiro's focus. Instead, Musashi would show up 3 hours late and not even brandishing his sword. Instead, he had a crude, hand-carved wooden sword that he fashioned from an oar. Kojiro, being incredibly frustrated with Musashi's lack of professionalism, drew his sword, casting aside his scabbard, and shouting, "Are you late because you are afraid?" In which Musashi would reply with the incredibly metal line, "If you have no more use for your sheath, you are already dead." NANI? And this would set Kojiro over the edge as he would launch his attack using his signature turning swallow cut. But Musashi had prepared for this. See, that oar that he fashioned into a sword was actually longer than Kojiro's Nodachi, giving Musashi the upper hand, allowing him to swiftly counter, striking Kojiro fatally atop the head. Though the battle was short, Musashi saw Kojiro as his greatest opponent, and with no challenges left to overcome, he would retire as a swordsman, living out the rest of his days as a teacher, artist, and philosopher. And even in death and defeat, Kojiro's influence would remain. The island of Funajima where the duel took place was later renamed to Ganryujima, in honor of Kojiro's fighting style and school in which he taught. A statue depicting their legendary duel would be erected as well, immortalizing Sasaki Kujiro's legacy in Japan. Alright, we just made it through 2 stories where the hero didn't kill their own child. Awesome! You know, I was really worried that was going to become a running theme, and let me tell you, I am just so glad we're past that and we can just move on. Well, anyway, that was a nice little break from the Greek characters, but Early Type Moon really liked those guys, so we're going right back to their mythology for the last servant we're talking about today. Castor, being represented by the sorceress Medea. Medea is the daughter of Attis, the king of Colchis, and the son of Helios, the god of the sun. Now, I don't think being a god's grandchild qualifies you as a demigod, but Medea did have some cool powers and an arsenal of potions and herbs that allowed her to bend the world to her will. She's also frequently associated with Hecate, the goddess of magic, so that may also play a role in her own sorcery. But Medea's story begins when a group called the Argonauts arrive in Colchis, led by a man named Jason. Jason was the heir to the throne of the kingdom of Iolcus, but control was unlawfully seized by his uncle, Peleus. In an attempt to take back control of his kingdom, he is ordered to retrieve the Golden Fleece, a symbol of authority and kingship. And it was the king of Colchis, Medea's father, who was holding the Golden Fleece. Upon being asked, King Attis would agree to give it to him, but on the condition that he would do some tasks. First, he had to yoke 2 fire-breathing bulls, then plow a field and sow it with serpent's teeth, which would then transform into warriors that he would have to fight. These are tasks that Jason would surely fail if attempted on his own. But luckily for him, the gods, particularly Hera, took interest in his quest. Knowing Medea's power alone would help Jason succeed, she approached Aphrodite, the goddess of love. Aphrodite would then have her son Eros shoot Medea with an arrow, causing her to fall in love with Jason. Medea would find Jason, anxious about his coming trials, and offer to help him, but on the condition that Jason would marry her and take her back home with him. He accepted, and Medea gave him an ointment that would protect him. And with it, he was able to complete the tasks. However, when they returned to King Attis, he refused to give them the fleece, as he never really intended on giving it up in the first place. Hence why he gave Jason this seemingly impossible mission. But when nightfall came, Medea led Jason to where her father was keeping the fleece. It was being guarded by a large dragon, but Medea used her power to put the dragon to sleep, and they were able to grab the fleece and run back to the Argonauts' boat, where they would sail out of Colchis. Upon learning about their theft, Attis was very angry. He would gather his men, including Medea's brother Epsirtis, and they would begin their pursuit. They would catch up to the Argonauts, with Epsirtis heading the pack and being the one to confront them. However, Medea would kill him, her own brother, chop him up into pieces, her own brother, and throw him into the ocean. She did that to her own brother, for a guy she just met, like yesterday. But having to pick up the pieces of his now deceased son would slow down Attis, and the Argonauts were able to get away. Afterwards, they would take a pit stop, seeking refuge on the island of Corfu. At this point, the Colchian flotilla would catch up to him, they'd approach the king of the island and demand that Medea be surrendered to them. The king would agree, but only if Jason and Medea had not yet laid together. Upon hearing of this condition, Jason quickly arranged for them to have an impromptu marriage, and dragged Medea off to a cave where they would consummate. And this allowed them to not be surrendered to the Colchians. Ah yeah, and something I neglected to mention in the Hercules portion of the video is that at some point he joined up with the Argonauts, and the hellbore that was given to him to cure his madness was actually given to him by Medea. That's not really all that relevant moving forward with Medea's story, but hey, it is a neat little fun fact. Eventually they were able to make it back to Iolcus, where Jason discovered that his uncle had killed his parents and his infant brother. Wanting to take revenge, Jason would again employ the help of Medea, who offered to kill his uncle herself, which Jason would allow. Medea would disguise herself as an old crone and approach Peleus, claiming that Artemis, the goddess of hunting and chastity, had come to bring good fortune, and as reward for his piety would make him young again. Peleus was of course skeptical, but Medea would convince him by turning herself back into a young woman, and use her powers to take a dead cut-up ram and return it back to life as a feisty young lamb. This would be enough to convince Peleus, and this is also where things get horrifying. Because you see, Medea would convince Peleus' daughter to be the one to cut him up under the impression that she was going to bring him back to life in a younger form. Of course, she did not. Instead, Medea would take the cut-up pieces of Peleus and put him in a cauldron, cooking him into a stew for several hours, because assassinating people the regular way is too mainstream. But horrific acts of deception aside, because of this, Jason and the Argonauts are able to take back control of Iolcus. However, Jason and Medea would leave Iolcus for good, going to Corinth, leaving the throne for Peleus' son, Acastus. In Corinth, Medea and Jason would live happily for several years, and even have some kids. Ah, how delightful. But over time, Jason would lose interest in Medea and instead fall in love with the much younger princess of Corinth, and arrange to marry her. Rightfully being enraged by Jason's infidelity, Medea would remind him of his promise to her, before storming off plotting revenge. And considering the things that she has done up to this point, you know it's gonna be horrific. At the wedding party for Jason and his new wife, Medea had sent a gift. This gift being a golden crown and a white robe for the bride to wear. But as soon as she put it on, it burst into an unquenchable flame that consumed everybody at the wedding party, except for Jason, leaving him alive to live with the great sin of cheating on the monster we've come to know as Medea. But it wouldn't end there, as she would return home and kill her and Jason's children. Afterward, Medea made her escape on a chariot pulled by winged serpents gifted to her by her grandfather Helios. And from there, Medea kinda just bounced around from place to place, and she'd have a couple more interesting misadventures before settling down in the Elysian fields after obtaining immortality. But yeah, that's pretty much it. The real stories behind the 7 servants of Fate Stay Night. If you enjoyed this video and want to see me do it again for the other titles in the Fate series, please leave a like and maybe even subscribe. But other than that, thanks for watching.